Hi, I'm Peter Vito, and today I'm going to introduce an ongoing debate about the potential dangers of modern light sources. Through reading through the statements of big institutions and also through having some insights into how French doctors are trained to advise their patients, I have noticed a quite substantial disagreement between the French and the international official mainstream views. Of course, in lighting, some cultural differences can be explained by biological or geographic variations. For example, blue eyes transmit more light, and northern genetics mean a greater sensitivity to light. Also, the further we go from the equator, the more people we find who have color deficiencies or other visual problems. As the sun takes different paths across the sky, the resulting intensity, spectral composition, duration, or incident angle of daylight covers a broad range. As the Danish architect Nanette Mathiesen very poetically put it, in the north, light is not a point but a surface. So it is no surprise that maximizing daylight and using warm electric lights are so distinctive in Scandinavian interior design, while Southeast Asia, for example, prefers cooler light sources and darker surfaces. However, it's not all about the path of the sun, and for example in Southeast Asia, these preferences have also not always been this way. As Junichiro Tanizaki, for example, made famous in his pretty weird book titled In Praise of Shadows, Japanese design used to be all about soft lights and natural forms until a sudden cultural change, through which Asian big cities eventually became the prototypes of super bright urban scenes. Similarly, differences between Germany or France can also not be explained by geographic differences. So, why the French? I don't know, but they tend to do everything differently. For example, all the way until 1993, they mandated selective yellow headlights on cars, while basically everybody else were already moving towards wider and eventually bluer headlights. All else being equal, selective yellow headlights provide greater visual acuity and less glare to others. I really wish they would make a comeback. But even today, it is clear that guidelines for lighting in France put an unusually large emphasis on safety. And this is well reflected in how they handle things in occupational health, as well as in the guidelines themselves. So now I will briefly go through these guidelines and compare them to the statements of international authoritative institutions. Occupational physicians in France learn about the spectral characteristics of different light sources and even about the massive increase in luminance with LEDs and how their ever-decreasing size contributes to glare. They also learn that current regulations are insufficient as they are based on measurements for acute harm. Naturally, these limits are known and respected since the blue light hazard can be relevant in certain occupations. Much more curious, though, is that French doctors get many pages of information on how only looking at this definition of blue light hazard is insufficient. Why? Because it cannot grasp the potential dangers of the growing cumulative exposure to blue light, which is mechanistically implicated in the formation of age-related macular degeneration, and that if indeed this is a danger, then the effects will only show up 20-30 years from now. Based on this reasoning, glasses with blue light filter are recommended to all office workers, many of whom get a pair for this purpose only, even if they otherwise don't need correction. The cost of this is largely paid by the complementary health insurance scheme called Mutuelle. Companies are usually required to pay this insurance for their employees. To be able to better understand employees' problems at the workplace, occupational physicians are also equipped with software to estimate exposures and a light meter to make basic measurements on the spot, mainly radiance levels at the location of the eye and illuminance on the horizontal work surface. This is a good start, but not always enough. Even the guidelines are now moving towards more sophisticated measures for workspace lighting. For example, a common scenario is that the office worker complains about too much light in the office. They say they cannot see the computer screen well, they get eye strain, they get headaches by the end of the day, they are very tired since the new lamps have been installed. So the doctor goes out to take measurements, and it turns out that the illumination levels barely even reach the recommended minimum. Again, this refers only to illumination at certain measurement points. The doctor knows that flicker is also suspect, but they cannot measure it. Same goes for computer screens. The occupational physician would then further check the ergonomics of the room, but the issue is not solved and nobody is happy. The employee is still struggling. The employer is angry because they just spent a lot of money on the new lamps and there is no resolution. Office workers instead often end up turning the lights off whenever they can. Any deeper analysis of such situations would require a lighting designer and certainly goes beyond the role of a physician. In some locations of employment, like fashion shops or other stores, overlighting is common as it helps with sales, and light levels for workers exceed those in the guidelines. In these cases, the occupational physician can only give advice, so if the employer does not change the lighting, as it would probably hurt the business, employees' complaints can only be resolved by a court, which rarely happens. Nevertheless, French doctors are much better educated and more prepared to deal with these situations than doctors in most other countries. For reference, the material for occupational physicians that I have here totals well over 1,000 pages. And this careful attitude originates in their guidelines, which seem to be in quite a basic disagreement with many other guidelines. At the core of this approach are the reports on lighting and health by ANSES, the French Agency for Food, Environmental and Occupational Health and Safety, most relevant of which is the one from 2019. This report not only deals with the broadly acknowledged short-term dangers of high-dosage blue light to the retina, but also details the state-of-the-art about the negative effects of cumulative long-term exposure. This is in stark contrast to the statements of many other institutions. For example, the authors of the 2019 ANSES report write, "Concerning cumulative exposure, epidemiological studies have shown that there is a long-term contribution of blue light to the occurrence of age-related macular degeneration." And they go into much more detail in the report. Please find links in the video description. From the other side of the debate, compare this to the position statement of the International Commission on Illumination. There have been claims that exposure to blue light may be linked to the risk of age-related macular degeneration. Such claims are currently speculative and are not supported by the peer-reviewed literature. Or take, for example, this debunking-style article published by the Illuminating Engineering Society. Those who insist that the massive doses of blue light present in LED lighting are harming our health are misinformed. Or look at this statement in a public information article by the American Academy of Ophthalmology. "Taking preventive measures against blue light, even though there is no evidence of damage, could be more harmful than the blue light itself." Or finally, though I could go on with this list forever, take a listen to Professor John O'Hagan speaking at a webinar of the Optical Society as he refers to the formation of age-related macular degeneration.
So we keep this in mind, but I would like to stress that there's no evidence that light sources cause this effect as opposed to very high levels of exposure to sunlight.
ANSES also points out the insufficiency of the most broadly accepted and used guideline by the ICN-IRP 2013, which only counts with acute exposure in its thresholds for blue light. Similarly, the French authors write, "Detailed spectral and temporal profiles of retinal exposure were computed based on realistic annual schedules of exposure to artificial light and daylight. The contribution of artificial light sources is not negligible compared to daylight, even when considering different climates and different times spent outdoors. Over a year, artificial light can represent up to 30% of the retinal exposure dose in the spectral range of the blue light phototoxicity." This statement refutes the most common argument, which claims that fears of blue light of electric light sources are unfounded because we are exposed to much more blue light from daylight. It is worth to note here that the physiological effects of different wavelengths of light interact with each other, and therefore this argument is anyway not really appropriate. Furthermore, the ANSES report urges to include automotive headlights as a regulatory concern regarding the blue light hazard and to regulate flicker too. Here, their position is also stricter than that of other institutions. There are many further topics like circadian disruption and so on, but to keep this video shorter, I won't go into details. Please check the sources if interested. So it is clear that there are disagreements between French guidelines and those of many other countries. And since the points of this disagreement are about open and unresolved questions, I think generally this is a good thing. My current views are not completely aligned with any of the statements of these institutions, or rather, it would depend on which question we're talking about exactly. However, I think the French are onto something. But let me know what you think, and till next time, take care.